Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Presbyterians Pub. I have a wonderful guest with me today. It's Pastor Mike Moses. Mike was actually one of my professors at my time at Gordon-Conwell, so it's good to see him again today and also have contact with him. Mike Moses is the founding and lead pastor of Lake Forest Church in Huntersville, North Carolina. And Mike, stop me at any time that I get any of this wrong. Lake Forest Church started in 1998 with just 42 congregants gathering in Huntersville bowling alley and then later a skating rink under a disco ball, which I found to be pretty awesome. Their original target audience was for people who've given up on church but not God. Since then, God has led Mike and the church into tremendous growth with now 4 congregations, including an Hispanic congregation, and dozens of ministries spanning the globe. Mike has also served in various leadership capacities, including the moderator of the EPC from 2015 to 2017, the National Church Planning Leadership Team, part of the EPC, and also part of Gordon-Conwell's Theological Seminary's Advisory Board and Children's Impact Network. He's also a fan of all things U2, which I am as well, and Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, and would you say, I would say a St. Patrick expert in some ways, or all things St. Patrick related. I could not resonate more, obviously, with these interests myself. So, Mike Moses, thank you for joining me today on Presbyterians Pub.
Luke, I appreciate it. And congratulations on your fairly recent ordination into the EPC. We're super glad that you're here, and just our interactions show that you're a thoughtful and faithful addition to teaching elders, leading our congregations with the Bible from the pulpit. Yes. So glad to have a fun exchange with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever seen U2 in concert?
Yes, I'm old enough to have done so when they were actually popularly relevant at the time. In Dodger Stadium, I went to Seminary in LA and took a kid in a youth group that Angie and I were leading in. I took him to the concert when they were playing around with like techno music and stuff. I forget the album, shame on me, but oh my gosh, what an experience. And then I saw them on the Elevation tour here in Charlotte.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I got to see them the first time when my wife got me tickets to them in Chicago, and I got to see them for a wedding present that she got me, which was incredible because I actually got her, for her wedding present, just some dorky little plaque, and she got me U2 tickets. So I'm forever indebted to her. But anyway, of course, welcome to the Presbyterians Pub, and this being the Presbyterians Pub, it is based around the public square and how we get together and discuss different information. So I have to ask you, what is your favorite brew? And if you can relate your brew to a theological construct, the better.
Well, I don't know if I can do that, but but it relates. My favorite brew is Guinness beer, and I was never a beer drinker. I drank wine off and on a little bit, but just didn't like beer. And you alluded to this earlier. My doctoral work was on the missiological leadership of St. Patrick, because someone introduced me to the fact that there were 2 surviving writings of his from the 400s, the 5th century. And when I read them, they're brief. I fell in love with his voice as a Christian missiological leader, and I wanted him to be my historical mentor. I was like, will you please mentor me? And he said yes. And so I did my dissertation on him. So my first pilgrimage to Ireland, Luke, to sort of touch the places I'd been researching, I got off the plane in Belfast, drove a little rental car straight to the traditional burial site of St. Patrick. It's not the real one, but it's a stand-in. Huge engraved stone of a Celtic cross, and here lies Patrick. And so I sat there, I did a stone rubbing in my journal, prayed, talked to the Lord, and gave thanks for St. Patrick. And a friend had made me promise. They were like, oh, you're going to Ireland, you'll get to drink Guinness. I was like, no, I don't drink beer. He's like, promise me the first pub you come to in Ireland, you will order a Guinness. So spent some time at Patrick's grave in this ancient, the town of Downpatrick. Walked down the cobblestone street to the first pub I came to. Turns out it's Denver's, Denvirs. It is the longest continuously serving public house in Ireland. Super cool. Like since the 12 or 1300s. I went in, bellied up, ordered a Guinness, and then started doing my geeky pastor doctoral thing and started writing in my journal. And immediately the national character of the Irish came through. Like, it's not a stereotype, it's true. They just insisted that I chat up everybody. I didn't buy another drink in that place. It was a great time. So since then, that's my favorite brew.
Yeah. Well, that is a great story. That's a wonderful theological relation there. And it's interesting, too, because I've heard something about Guinness that in Ireland, it's a whole other experience. It's like a rite of passage kind of thing. I've heard it just tastes better. Probably the atmosphere helps.
It's like if you drink a wine at the winery while walking through that terroir. I imagine that's a better experience. I wouldn't really know, but yeah.
Right,
Thanks
right.
for asking. And what is yours? I'm sure everyone else knows this, but
Oh, well, yeah, yeah. I'm the same way, just with anything kind of Belgian related. If I had my choice, I will have anything probably from the brewing company Chimay. They make a great brew called the Chimay Blue. The monks, they still make it today, or so the story goes. It goes way back to when they started brewing it, like 800 years or something. But I just love the story behind things. I'm the same way with teas or with going to the Coca-Cola factory or something and trying all the different uh, styles there and kind of knowing where they come from and the context behind it. I just really get involved in good story and background.
well, and Luke, the story of Guinness, there's a book called Guinness and God. Ever heard of it?
No, I have not, but
Oh,
I need to get up probably.
it's the origin story. And so the Irish famously had fallen into become this great impoverished island because of oppression by the English. And the and people were drinking themselves to death, making home potato, what kind of alcohol you make out of potato, whatever that is.
Like a vodka or something. Yeah.
Vodka or something, yeah. No, it's lower than that. But anyway, they were just like killing themselves, literally. So the Guinness family, who were believers, literally invented a alcoholic brew that people would drink, but it had like the calories of a meal.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was good for you. It's why I don't drink Guinness that often. So it was actually a business ministry, like a kingdom way of starting a business. And it became so popular, it made a large difference in that generation. I'll forget which decade, sometime in the 1800s. I
Yeah,
believe it.
yeah. No, I believe it. I believe it. Drinking a Guinness is like eating a loaf of bread. But hey, there you go, listener. You have your first recommendation of the day, Guinness and God. So go check that out. I'd like to know more about that myself. But this is a good segue because this conversation actually does have something to do, even our conversation around St. Patrick definitely has something to do when we talk about the things of race and ethnicity, because that's a large part of what even he had to deal with. But today I'd really like to go further, because when we first started talking online, it came about when I wrote or did a video as a response to this open letter that went out, which you can see in the former Presbyterians Pub, the last one I did, an open letter that came out from some EPC pastors and leaders who were trying to engage in a conversation with the EPC around ideas of ethnicity and race and how we can maybe do better and we can grow in that area, or some things we might be missing out on. And so that kind of led us into discussion, talking a little bit about ethnicity and its importance, but particularly what role it plays for born-again Christians, because so many times I think we can even get ahead of ourselves and say, well, I've been born again, so my ethnicity doesn't matter. I'm just Christ, or my background doesn't matter. And we know that isn't entirely true, because those things do matter. But it does beg the question: is how far do we push it when it comes to our identity? Is race and ethnicity something that makes us up completely, and what role does it really play in the church and Christian life?
Luke, when we founded our church, one of the core values we wrote up that was aspirational was for our church to be part of racial reconciliation in this country, recognizing, at any point in our nation's history, you can look up and say there are wounds. Even so, I think I operated for well over a decade or so with a default setting that the ideal is actually to get beyond race. and ethnicity, and to, as you said, hey, I'm born again, you're born again. What is white and black between us? What is this or that between us? I think I had this idea that the gospel transcends ethnicity and maybe blends it or something. I don't know. Who knows? But with help from friends, and then really pointed by our denominations beginning to take seriously what's called the Revelation 7-9 task force, has been very prophetic toward me, Luke. I began to see how the Bible not only is not afraid to just name ethnicity, like front to back, and name it as an indicator in a person, and unapologetically. Not like, well, we don't want to call them a black Christian or a white Christian. Like Paul's letters, think of how often it's about, hey, you Jewish Christians and you Greek Christians are fighting. We need to tear down the barrier between the two. There's a dividing wall of hostility between y'all. Jesus tore it down. Why are y'all still fighting, in opposite? The first conflict in the church in Acts, you'll remember better than I which chapter. The very first conflict was, hey, ethnic differences and inequities are being played out in the blessed community. The Greeks are widows are getting served less food. And you recall what the solution was, Luke?
Yes.
Can you tell us?
Oh, how they appointed deacons for them?
Yeah,
that story.
And they
yeah.
appointed some Hellenistic or Greek-oriented people to serve at tables, so it was an ethnicity-based problem, and the part of the solution was organizational, but they dared to include race. And then just the last, because I know this is sort of an overview question. I think what has, and really this was just a General Assembly last year, 2 years ago, when the Revelation 7-9 task force was speaking, and there was a lot of preaching. Like, by the way, the EPC now I don't know about your Presbyterian meeting, but our Presbyterian meetings and General Assembly, I'm so proud of how they've grown the percent of content to teaching, fellowship, worship, and equipping. Like, I love going because I'm going to get great stuff. But I had never thought before that Revelation 9 says, John's vision says, in that day, I saw before the throne a multitude of every nation, tribe, language, people. And that word nation is ethne. I mean, I know that the teachings of the Bible are that you and I, in our resurrected state, and everyone listening to us, we will be personally recognizable. We'll relate the way Jesus was in his transformed self. I had never thought that ethnicity would be a part of that. And there it is, valued in John's vision as still a part of us. Now, you and I can talk for days on the unhealthy ways that postmodern philosophers and identity philosophers make identity only about race, et cetera, et cetera. But God made it. Evidently, it honors him, like the Trinity, right? The Trinity, God is one, and yet there's beauty in God's, what's the right way to say it? Plurality, or in the same way, all of creation is one by God, but the diversity of plants, the diversity of animals, the diversity of different kinds of salamanders glorifies God. And he chose for that to play out in the human community and for that to be permanent. I think that's fascinating. I don't know what all that means, Luke. But really for the first time, I'm pondering what that means for us today in the church.
Yeah, no, that's great. I completely agree. And, I kind of talked a little bit about this with one of our conversations with Dean Weaver. We were talking about Revelation 7-9 and that picture there. We were talking about if that's descriptive or prescriptive. And Dean said that it's most likely both. And I tend to almost agree with that because we know that it's descriptive in the sense that, yes, ethnicity is important and how people have been created and the creativity of God and the beauty in that, and those things, they stick with us and they make up who we are. And obviously that's still on display in heaven. But also when you look at if it's prescriptive, then how are we going to build a formula or build a creative way of, I guess, displaying that in our churches? Because sometimes you can see what happens is that we recognize maybe those minority voices that haven't been pictured in our churches or don't have a voice in our churches, and therefore we highlight them so much so to the case that we almost become segregationists in some ways, in the fact that we like build them their own task force or build them their own team in some way, and then we just become segregated and we actually don't become unified.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I agree with you, Luke. And I think part of it is, yes, we need to, and we are recapturing, at least in EPC, this is a part of God's good creation, and it is part of His new creation, and we're supposed to be signposts and billboards of the kingdom that is coming, even as we pray and work toward Thy kingdom come here on earth as it will be in heaven, or as it is in heaven and will be in the new heavens and new earth, to be very specific. But I think maybe part of what you're getting to is something we're wrestling with in America, and American Christians is not only is it a part of God's good creation, it's also a part of the fall. And we as Christians it's biblical for us to confess sin, to name sin. We're not shy to do it. The scriptures are not shy to do it. An unhealthy church is one in which we're too shy to name stuff sin. I've told my other pastors on staff, if you start hearing me in too many sermons only use the words, hey, you might need, God cares about you even though your mistakes and where you've messed up. If I don't use the word sin regularly, one of y'all needs to come and rebuke me. I'm not being a biblical Christian. And I think sin in the area of ethnicity is what we are wrestling with as a nation. And we have varying degrees of comfort level attaching ethnicity and ethnicity-based even sin. It's pretty easy for us to go back 400 years, and when the white colonial powers began to coerce enslaved Black labor for capital, for purposes of enriching ourselves and building stuff we built, pretty easy for us to go back and go, that was sin. And I hope those people confess. I'm glad John Newton confessed of it as a slave trader and wrote Amazing Grace, glad for that. But talking about it today is very difficult and complex. I'm certainly no expert. I have not figured out the key for that. So to your point, I think because we've sort of taken a lid off maybe in society recently, and I think the events of this summer and the videos, the several just horrifying videos of a Black man being shot and killed, either by those white neighbors in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, or the Mr. Floyd murder. We are talking about the sinful aspect of race relations in America, but we're not used to it. At least I don't think white people and white Christians are. We're used to only talking about it in the past tense. So it's really unfamiliar. It's delicate. It's fraught. And our two political parties, who am I to say, but if they can get in power by cynically co-opting a word or two so that everybody who agrees with this word or disagrees with that word will therefore have to vote for them, that's not beneath either of our political parties, making it more fraught. So I'm not sure I addressed your your specific, but I didn't hear a specific example in there that I could respond to.
Yeah, let me put it this way, and that's very helpful what you just said, because you're right. This summer we have really seen the lid taken off. Many different tensions that have been brewing in our communities, even in our congregations, and I think obviously, yeah, the conversation, and one of the reasons we're talking about today, the conversation has been heightened 100% into what does this mean for us as a nation, and what does it mean for us as a church. And so I guess really the question I want to pose is how does the Christian and the Christian worldview, what kind of hope does it offer? What's the news that it offers in light of maybe what the world is even asking? Because I think we should be keeping the question in light of being born again believers, that obviously there is something that has changed within us, something that's different about us, because there is this, as we talked about at the beginning, there is this tendency right now for there to be such an emphasis on race or on the differences between us that we end up dividing one another and applying narratives that actually don't make the enemy sin and death, but make the enemy actually other groups and other people. And I think that that's where maybe a lot of the pushback is coming from, maybe other individuals in our church who are trying to be helpful and trying to see things through the lens of what it means to be the body of Christ, but are also concerned that a lot of the worldly narratives that are being applied are not hopeful, they're not helpful, they're divisive, and they're not pointing us to the greater narrative that we are one in Jesus, because that is true. I mean, Paul talks about that, there's no more hostility lines. We are neither Jew nor Greek, barbarian or Scythian, but one in all. We are one in Christ. And therefore, we have to be thinking, okay, well, how do we offer that to the world without also eliminating a person's individuality and their background and where they came from and their ethnicity and things of this nature? So what does the world offer that's different to the culture? What does Christianity offer? What do we say that's different and doesn't adopt maybe some social theory or social narrative that is frankly not Christian?
I think our hope is again, I'm spent my whole life studying the Bible. I'm a doctor in it, but I'm not the best at chapter and verse. But in Colossians, Paul literally said, he's talking about conflict that is ethnicity based. And I'm using the word ethnicity because Revelation 7:9 uses the word ethnos, nation. And then this is where I would say I think Revelation 7:9, it's definitely errs on the side of descriptive. But the Great Commission, Jesus used that same word, ethnos. Go to all the nations with the gospel. And so that one is prescriptive there. And so in Colossians, Paul's like, hey, we're doing that. We've got a couple of ethnos in this church, Greek speaking and Jewish, and y'all are fighting. And he says in the gospel, God has torn down the wall of hostility between the two. That's a direct quote. Mm-hmm. And then essentially he's saying, so live like it. The gospel is the power for unity. The gospel is the power to overcome the sin in the past and the present that has anything to do with race or ethnicity. And the gospel has the power to restore whatever God's ideal original intent was, that there would be this diversity of ethnos in the globe, and yet representing three in the Trinity, and yet a harmony in the human community representing the oneness of God. And so the gospel is the ground zero point for that. How you and I apply that as leaders of our congregation, how members of our church live that out day to day are many different ways. And I bet you have some good examples. Does that mean, and this is getting a little bit to what you were saying earlier, does that mean therefore that it is sinful for my church to continue to have our worship music be sort of adult alternative rock, early 2000s, that people of other races don't care about that? They're not buying CDs of Nirvana or whoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is that sinful for my church to worship in that style, in a way that includes unchurched people of a white Gen X culture, and is the musical heart language of the soul for white people in our culture. No, I don't think that's sinful. However, and that's what we've done for 22 years. However, we have a calling at Lake Forest we're asking the Lord for our worshiping congregation on Sunday mornings in 5 to 10 years. I'm being squishy on it. Okay, Luke. To represent the ethnic makeup of our zip code. And then when we get there, we may ask it for one zip code out, which would be a big, huge deal. And we're talking and thinking through, what does that mean? Are there some change? And we are making a few changes, not ones where we're unrecognizable finally as a church. And we don't have a goal of, it's not possible for us without bussing people in to say, in fact, I've had this argument at church planning circles in the EPC. There's some who argue that unless your church is measurably multi-ethnic, that no race is greater than 80%, that's not a biblical church. And they take that out of the book of Acts and the church at Antioch. I completely disagree with that. I think it's God's ideal that we reflect our zip code. Mm-hmm. And I think as people like you and I reflect on this, as we reflect on it through our congregation, I think over time, well, I don't want to be the gradualist who Dr. King said might be the greatest enemy of things getting better between the races. I'm very aware of that, but in my temperament, I'm a gradualist. Mm-hmm. And so we are making a few changes that hold our feet to the fire. So do I think a church has to be multi-ethnic all of a sudden to be biblical? In no way. And I think that's maybe what you were getting at. Do we almost resegregate in order to,
the prescriptive kind of model instead of
sort of what's the right phrase? Engineer.
Quotas and that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Now I will say, Luke, the next church that we are planting, we're actively interviewing church planters right now, is in an area of Charlotte that is 37% white, 37% black, and the rest are Latino and Indian immigrants. And we are looking for that church to begin with co-leadership. Our idea, we're asking the Lord to send us a lead pastor who's a person of color. And we're asking God to raise up a multi-ethnic church there because that's those zip codes.
Sure.
And we think it would really look weird for the gospel if a church weren't.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, because honestly, it's the same way with a multitude of factors, particularly age. I know there's some statistic, and beware, I make 99% of my statistics up on the spot, but some statistic that talks about the pastor's age reflects kind of the congregation in some way. The congregation looks a lot like the age of the pastor, and I know that people seem to congregate and get around those that are kind of like them. Unfortunately, that's just kind of a human thing.
Luke, your statistic is correct that a congregation generally, if a pastor's been there for a good while, generally reflects 5 years younger and a 10-year span, 5 years younger than the pastor. However, that is if you don't intervene. That's how it will naturally go. And I think it may be true with a sense of welcome, and I could fit here for people of other races worshiping. And this is where we would get. Are you familiar with the concept of a sigmoid curve?
No, I am not.
So the statistic you just mentioned, the age range in a church, is if you don't mess with it. That's the way people naturally work. And that's kind of like the natural statistics of the life cycle of a church. It's born, it inclines, it grows, it reaches a place of plateau, and we're chilling now. And if you stay there too long, it starts to recline and then decline. That's the natural cycle of a church life. If you don't intervene somewhere here at the plateau or the incline, the recline, and the intervention is what you can do. And this is true with age level. And I believe it's true because of the example of Hope Church, EPC in Memphis, which is the largest Presbyterian church in America and just technically reached multi-ethnic status. because of this intentionality. When the church reaches somewhere on its upper growth curve, you can change to a sigmoid curve by drastic shaking of the system. And in church world, that would generally be a revisioning, followed by vigorous, purposeful, Holy Spirit driven activity of the congregation toward a fresh vision of itself. And that's when, so here's the normal life cycle curve. I wish I had a pencil, is like a hillock. The sigmoidal curve, it goes like this, but then instead of reclining, it's interrupted and there's a fresh incline. I think that is the case. I've seen that. We're doing that in our congregation after 20 years. Seeing that sigmoid curve on young families in our church again, because we did some things to change that, including being super intentional of all the lieutenant level of staff in my church. We went crazy young for a while. And you know what happened? All of a sudden, we've got as high a percentage of families with babies in our church today as when I started the church, and I was a guy with 2 babies. So I think that gives me hope, Luke, that we could make the same kind of visionary intervention in this matter of the makeup of our congregations.
Oh, 100%. I agree with that. Absolutely. And, right now, myself and our church, we're kind of doing the same thing with a revitalization project that we're doing in Kansas City. And, we've been way down on that curve and the declining kind of spiral of that curve. And now we have to come to a point where the congregation has to recognize, that the sins they have committed were important and they made an impact on us, and we need to recognize those. And we're seeing, just in the case of the book of Nehemiah and what he did there and through Ezra and Zerubbabel, you can't blame other people for not having the right leader, or blame blame the leader you had, or the fact that people moved out of the community. But rather the first step, as we know, is identifying that you do have a problem and things have gone astray, and address that, hey, look, we didn't take care of the community. We didn't look after it. We didn't care for the people or go after the younger generations. And we've either been complicit or lazy or whatever it may be. And I'm just so glad that you brought that up, because I think that is a really important thing for churches to pay attention to, and what you've seen in your church planting experience, because it's also important for churches that think they're healthy and they may be on the verge of going down on that spiral, and they need to make adjustments before it turns to the point of no return in some ways. But I want to back up a little bit and really circle something for those that have been listening that maybe had been a bit confused. And I really want to circle and look at the word identity, because I think identity is something that has changed a lot, maybe in the culture or even in the view of the church, and even just the past 5 to 10 years. And it's really important for us to understand, even as we look at this biblically, because our culture, and not necessarily the church, but our culture has gotten really absorbed with identity and what makes up a person's identity. And usually it revolves around a person's sex, gender, or preference therein. And of course, race tends to be a very, very key thing for people identifying themselves. And, I tend to argue from the individualistic approach towards things, and believe that identity is obviously a multivariate element. And so, you can, but you also are more than just, the sum of your parts, but you are a father, brother, if someone's a mother or daughter, you have elements to yourself to make up your personality. But you may see that, like, this plays itself out in social situations, for example, with our culture and even in our church, that when we address our communities, you'll see pastors, they get up and before saying anything at all, they have to give a huge long preface, like myself, for example, Luke Johnston. I am a straight white male, and I recognize that about myself, and therefore it gives me a step down in the conversation, or I'm having to recognize that I have this oppressor role for some reason. And I think that is beginning to be seen more and more in our churches, and more a part of our narratives. And it's really just a permeation from the culture that has happened, that you are defined by your race or your sex, and that's it. That's all you are. That's the sum of your parts, is your race and sex. And therefore, that becomes like a god or an idol to every now to one of us, because to address that, or to have a problem with that, or to disagree with that, or to say, no, you're more than those things, is to reject that person's identity entirely. It's to inject who they are, and they'll say, you're denying my experience. And so we really end up shifting the preface in an incorrect way by making ethnicity, for example, our identity, and therefore the church kind of has to restructure itself. So my thought is, how do we just avoid such pitfalls like that are, divisive?
Here's a suggestion, and then I have one action that I think is super important that the Lord is leading me to, and I'm inviting the congregation to go with me. One, to what you said about identity, I think it's really important that we as evangelical Christians, at least me, I grew up with this slippery slope fear that was put on anything and everything. I was in a no drinking church. Hey, if you have one beer, that's a slippery slope to, Luke, he's on a slippery slope. He drinks Belgian beer. Any issue, oh no, what about the slippery slope? And therefore we don't, we may not even engage it. And so I would encourage due to that dynamic that I think is still in evangelicalism, I would encourage you to be careful and your listeners to not conflate the identity issues coming from the LGBTQ plus community, that whole discussion, and that of race. There are plenty of people who do conflate it, and it's all the same for them. But what we're, as biblical Christian, because they've got whatever their agenda is, I don't even study all that enough to know. Just recently I Googled intersectionality, and I still don't quite get it, Luke. Please don't explain it to me right now. I can't say I've got my head around what is meant by that.
No one really does. It doesn't.
Yeah. But I'd be careful that we let bringing our biblical values to this human sexuality conversation is one thing. To the race discussion is very different. There's nothing inherent. There's no censure in Scripture for anything having to do with ethnos, and it's part of the imago Dei. It's part of the image of God in us. And so I would just separate them. Is my thought there. And I agree. So I'm going to agree with you, and then I'm going to say, but here's my to be sure comment. I'm not interested in living in a place or a world or a church where we always do have to preface like you just said. Although I know the circumstances in which it's appropriate for me to do that, and I do it. Our core identity, and this is our teaching on sexuality at Lake Forest, is one of the reasons why it's difficult for same-sex attracted people to envision being a faithful Christian as even possible is because they bought the lie that their sexuality is their identity. But we straight Christians have bought the lie that so many other things are our identity above our identity as children of God. And for the church to be a winsome community to same-sex attracted who maybe are attracted to Jesus, we've got to, first of all, show what it means to live out of our identity in Christ first, not being a Republican or Democrat first, or libertarian, or not being whatever it is, right? Those are the big ones at the moment. As we invite them to find their core identity in Christ. So now, as it relates to all the stuff going on in America with race, I'd like to point to something very simple, Luke, because you and I, you're a smart guy. Just how you talk about things, things I've seen, even your response to that paper. I appreciate you're a good theological thinker. You're in touch with what's going on in the world. But we could get hung in the church talking about is intersectionality right or wrong? And we could miss a few of the things that are the big E on the eye chart. And I'd be interested in your response to this. Jesus said, I think it was him. No, I'm sure it is. If somebody asks you to walk a mile carrying their stuff, go 2. If somebody asks you for your coat, and by the way, he's implying the Roman enemies, I think. Ask you for your coat, give them a shirt too. Okay, so if our Black, and now I'm going to say specifically Christian brothers and sisters with whom we are yoked in the body of Christ, are asking us to listen to them as white Christians, especially white evangelicals. And this is what the Black pastors in Charlotte have asked. We were on this big, huge Zoom of every theology stripe. It was super interesting because of some stuff going on here. And then these are my friends as well. We have a partner African-American church that's non-EPC. Every Black Christian friend is saying to me publicly and privately, Mike, we're just asking for white Christians to listen, to actually, and here's where identity does come in, Luke. I think if we deny that there's something to our identity tied to our race, you and I could be tempted to deny that there's a perspective that I have growing up as a white person who's heard things talked about the same way my whole life, from white leaders, white family. I could deny that that's actually a thing, that I have a white perspective. I'm a liberally arts trained guy. I'm trained to look at things from every point of view, and I like that. You are too. But in the end, we see things the way we've been enculturated to see them, is also a fact. And so that's the healthy part. I think we need to own up of identity as white Christians and go, maybe I've only seen all these things the way that I see them and the way that white Christians talk about, well, duh, because of my exposure. And maybe since Black Christians are actually asking us, would you listen to us and quit arguing for a minute? And would you believe us as Black Christians? And where you find that there might, where if you're open enough to look and where you find and agree with us that there might be inequity or injustice that is somehow allocated or misallocated based on race in this country, then would you do something with us? I'm trying to make it that simple at this moment.
No, I appreciate that. And, I'll have to be careful here because I don't want to go down too much of a wormhole for the sake of time. But there's a couple of things that I want to address here. And I know you asked me not to express or explain intersectionality because there is a lot to it, and I don't think I perfectly understand it either, and I wouldn't try to go there. But part of the question that I posed was to kind of get us thinking about this idea, because in intersectionality and talking about individuals, does have this idea that if you are, like, for example, white, straight, or, meet this box or this box, and don't have any intersections of oppression, therefore you're missing a big part of the picture. You don't have a full truth claim, which, is some level of truth because none of us see perfectly everything, and that goes for every individual. But our intersections, the more intersections you do have, or points of oppression, giving your ethnicity or sex, for example, therefore gives you a bigger truth claim. But to me, of course, that's a bit too vague, and I think is a part of this conversation because it assumes a couple of things. It assumes, first of all, that all white experience is the same. And of course, I know you don't believe that. And we all have differences and things that make us up, but it assumes in the general, in mass, that there is something about, being white, give it advantages or privileges that makes you not understand or see things correctly. But it also assumes that all people of color, think the same or have the same experience or have the same expression. And we know that that's just simply not the case. We talk about listening to people. Of course, we should all do better. We should all do better at listening. That's key. And we have to be prepared to listen instead of just trying to destroy people's points or lines, particularly when someone's saying, hey, I got a problem going on and I really need you to hear me. Of course, it's insulting to not listen or try to explain it away or explain away their experience. And I think that's incredibly arrogant to do so. But I'm working here in Kansas City in a relatively diverse area in an old part of town, and I listen, I've heard from Hispanics and Asians and African Americans in our community, and they of course don't even come close to having the same opinion. So it goes back to that simplistic view that our friends of color think the same, and when we begin to say, well, you're not listening, really what that means is you're not agreeing, and you need to agree. You need to fall in line with this idea. And of course, that shuts down dialogue and conversation. It puts it right out the window, and essentially is saying we're adopting intersectionality because, hey, if you disagree at all, if you push back with any kind of nuance, you're either arrogant or racist or just haven't read enough of the right books.
Great points. You make great points. And and I think it's, um, uh, does the fact that I'm white and most of my influencers are white mean that I can never speak up in a room full of non-white people to an issue? No, that's an extreme view that I don't find interesting. But I think you and I do need to own the common sense side of that. Like one of my sons ended up going to a college that had he went to a public high school, and there was just a ton of kids at this college because of what it was, from rich private schools in the Northeast, like the hoity-toity ones. Super bunch of rich kids at Dillon's college. And he would often have this moment like, they have no idea. There would just be simple things at meals or spring break. He's going to come home and they're like, "Hey, you going to come with us to Bora Bora for spring break?" And Dylan's like, they're just assuming everybody has the money. Every 20-year-old in college has it. So they're just a perspective they don't get. And I think we need a common sense approach to that, Luke. And so I think our listening needs to be an extremely active listening to understand. If my wife comes to me and says, "Hey, babe, we got a problem in this area of our marriage," and I go, "There's no problem. It's working for me. Great. Good luck with figuring that out." We know that's not love. So if we are yoked as brothers and sisters with Black Christians in America, so I would say pick out Black Christian voices. I'm not interested in the voices. I'm interested, but I want to really hear. So we have a partner African American church, Luke, and that we've been partners with for several years. We're about to start a 4 Monday nights in a row Zoom mixed up small groups Bible study on what the Bible teaches about justice. Their members and our members. Super cool. I'm not leading it. So we're close. This pastor is like a pastor at our church, Pastor Davis. He's a Black pastor. He's preached once or twice a year there for years. So I gave our congregation a chance to listen to him on my podcast. Woo, Lordy, he told us what Black Christians think. Again, not all of them. He doesn't speak for everybody, but he let some stuff out. And I was super clear. Hey, I'm listening to my friend Byron. And I went, but listen to Black Christian friends that we respect on matters of justice, on matters of all the things that we're dealing with right now. And there is a point. And Luke, I can't solve that. When I've listened to really understand and I still don't agree with them, I think we still better be very humble before we say, all you Black Christians saying that race plays a role in how justice and resources are allocated today in America. I think we need to be really humble before saying all of you are wrong. I don't know what all to solve that. That's not my expertise at all. But
I agree. It would be the height of arrogance to say, you're wrong completely and I deny your experience. And I think anecdotal evidence is still important. What we have experienced is important, and we should be definitely prepared to listen to people, particularly when they've experienced traumatic events. And I understand what you're saying too about the slippery slope argument. I agree. Not every slipperiness leads to the slope. So we just need to be able to have, thorough conversations and be able to foster areas of dialogue where people can feel at liberty to speak forthrightly, because that's the only way we'll ever learn anything. If I can risk offending you by saying what I think. And you're absolutely right, about humility. We have to be humble, particularly when someone is coming to us with an issue or a problem that's been dramatic in their life and that they've been dealing with, and they're asking for help. And so, this is also where I can tend to get in trouble, and others maybe similar like me with these conversations, because I always tend to push, to see things with nuance and as the individual as much as possible, and deal with things, with a case-by-case basis. And when we bring up things like social justice or disparities, I always want to look at things kind of individually, and I want to look at them with the evidence behind it and what it actually means, and the many multivariate analyses that could be put into why things are the way they are. And I get in trouble because the pushback comes perceived as white-splaining, or using logic, or using white tools of oppression to fight against people. And the same can happen. They call it mansplaining, when I'm speaking to a woman in the same way. And I understand that. But I do believe that kind of attitude has crept in from the culture, and not necessarily as a slippery slope, or that we're going to become the culture completely. But in this culture, we live, any kind of pushback is seen as suspicious. And it can be a dangerous thing, because we begin to silence voices that want to be nuanced. And I know that sounds extreme, but you kind of know a little bit about my own personal story, what happened to me in one of my denominations. And of course, it doesn't happen in every denomination. I'm not trying to visit the EPC with that, not at all. But when we start to, speak up and get that pushback, there start to be things to be said like, "Oh, you're young, you're arrogant, you're harsh," or something like that. You're offending people of color, or you're offending my colleagues of color, and you're hurting them. And I agree that don't get me wrong, I totally agree, and particularly on the big issues. Yes, there is racism. Yes, there are things that are systemic. Yes, there are privileges in various different ways. All I'm saying is, can we look at things in a new way that's going to be better for us as a church, where we allow for dialogue, where whatever it may be, the white evangelicals can speak and say, I hear you, but here's like some of the concerns, and that they feel that they're heard and not shut down, in the same way that people of color would not want to feel that way. Because I think that's the only way we can move forward, if we begin to recognize others, where they're coming from and where they're trying to get at, instead of just thinking, "Oh, those silly white evangelicals, they don't get it. They haven't read this book. They haven't done this history. They're blind to it, or they've just been pushed off, but they've siloed themselves." Well, maybe no, maybe not so much. And if, we're going to be heard and move forward, we need to not be crushing each other or slam dunking on one another with these ideas, but rather listening. And I think that goes both ways.
True. And part of, as you're saying that, it's one of the reasons why I think it's important. I'm encouraging my friends and congregation to listen to Black evangelical voices. Now, I haven't gone and looked for enough of them. I need to do that, because there's so much that we share there. There's so much that we share in our faith. If I could, one of the ways out is to move toward a little bit of hope, I think, is to not insist that we're going to agree in a dialogue with the cause, or even necessarily the systemic or not systemic nature, but okay, I agree with you. The facts on the ground are, and here's one, household wealth per capita, Black and white, it is one of the most dramatically different numbers. It's made me cry the first time I saw it. Accumulation of household wealth is an example of, okay, we can agree that's a fact. How about, I'm not going to keep arguing about how that we got there. What can we do about that? And so let me just tell you one really cool thing that I and a couple of our Christian businessmen are going to be doing in order to have listened to our brothers and sisters of color about inequity of opportunity. And so there's a couple of business owners in our church, great guys. We've been in a Bible study oriented for business owners that I led for some time. Love the Lord. It's a group of 3 or 4 guys. They're a little bit all over the map politically, but mostly conservative. And so we got on the phone, and one was like, "I have this idea. I don't want to get involved politically about all this. I don't have time for that. And I probably won't agree with almost any of it, but I want to do something." And so we know that one of the inequities in Charlotte, for example, that will only perpetuate itself and become worse is white teenagers and college students, because they've grown up primarily in affluent homes. And I'm talking about my town, Charlotte. They have access. Now, this is really granular, Luke. They have access to internships that then in high school grant them greater access to the colleges they want to go to, and in college, access to internships that grant them access to great jobs. You have to look no further than my children. My son was thinking about being an attorney. How many attorneys do I know? How many fingers do I have? He applied, and they're like, "We love to have, the Moses boy here." Now shift to the large percent of impoverished Black congregation. There's an area called West Charlotte that is the most intractable areas of poverty in our town. And our sister church includes congregation members from there. So my business guys are like, what if? So if there's unequal access to internships at that teenage age, when you can start learning how to be somebody in work, how to talk to people, earn your way into college, and then in college, the internship that's really cool and gets you a job interview. What if we start a ministry that gives access to teenagers in our partner, predominantly African-American, predominantly poor families congregation, access to internship connections through Lake Forest Church business people? Mm-hmm. We don't need to talk about how we got there to inequity, inequity of opportunity, to internships. That's a really specific thing, Luke. Mm-hmm. But that is beautiful. Like, that is a gospel motivation. Mm-hmm. I have, and God tells me to share. He just does.
Yes, that's for
sure. So they're going to set up we're going to have kind of like a matching system for teenagers who are interested in the West Charlotte area. I can't wait for that. Can't wait. That'll be next spring. So that's one little thing that gives me some hope.
Absolutely. And I know we're out of time, and I want to respect your time, but I 100% agree. And I think it's a really good point for those who are listening today, and I hope that's where we can really focus on with this conversation, is don't get bogged down in these details, because we can't really even know exactly what led us here, and that's where we tend to end up fighting each other. And we can't exactly know every detail, because it's complicated. There's a lot that went into the history of what brought us to where we are now. And there are things we do need to recognize. And I think we have to start with, what is the reality today? What are the disparities today? What are the injustices today? And how are we primarily going to move forward to not repeat them, but to impact our communities in the world? And I think that, some of the best solutions, they come from the church, just like what you're saying. And I know that can be debated, because, the political sphere obviously has importance and can make true change, but there's something about the church. God has picked it as a particular unit chosen by him, with the ability to make great change. And, of course, that's what I want to see, and I know it's what you want to see. And even what we're seeing, what's going on in the EPC in Revelation 7:9, those seem to be the solutions. We're beginning to find more and more ways how we can move forward together in unity, and not focus so much on the how or why we got here, that drags each other through the weeds and tries to really over-focus on the past. But all we can really do is move forward. And of course, moving forward requires addressing things from the past, but ultimately, if we're not talking solutions and we're not allowing each other to listen, we will get bogged down.
Well said.
Thank you for doing this, Mike. Thank you for taking the time. Sorry to have you minutes over, but maybe we can talk again sometime, because I do think that even just St. Patrick and what he dealt with, the world of ethnicity, all about it, was huge. So.
Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about something he says at the end that is so provocative, ethnically speaking, in his day. That's another time.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Mike. God bless you, and thank you for joining us at the pub, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to you soon, or maybe virtually GA or so.
Thank you, Luke. I'm honored to be invited into this conversation with you. Take care.
Yeah, God bless you. Bye-bye.